AngularJS introduction today. That's what's the agenda for today's session. And let me just open up Edureka. Here is some basic instructions that I want you to understand. It will help you over the course of the session. When you open Edureka site, you will find a login space here on the right hand side. And in case you have already created a login, it's absolutely okay. Just click on that particular section and go to my profile. You will have all the details of your courses out there. Or what you can do is you can click on courses and click on my courses. You will be directed to the my courses section. If you have not logged in, please go ahead, sign up, and you will be able to find all the registered courses within the section here in my courses. When you click on my courses, you'll have a list of courses that you have registered for or you are a part of. Click on go to course. In this section, you will have a page that opens up with getting started. That's basically your basic instructions of what this particular course is all about, what is the training sessions, what are the practical sessions, what is the technical support details, and all those aspects of the session. You'll have pre-recorded sessions with AngularJS from older batches, so you should be able to go ahead, look at those sessions as well. And in case you want to go ahead, prepare well in advance before the class, you can also do that. You can go ahead, listen to the sessions and then come to the class. That's always beneficial. In the third tab, you'll have a course content. And in this course content, you'll have different sections, module 1, module 3, module 4, and so on and so forth. Each module refers to the specific module that we'll be covering in this particular section, and we'll have the details of presentation, a quiz, all the demo codes that we are going to do, and an assignment and pre-work section that will be given to you at the end of this particular module or whatever module you are doing. All right, so this is how you go ahead and check your sessions. If you're not aware of it, it's always a good idea to go to the sections here. You will have the recording available after each of the sessions, so you will have a pre-recorded session that is going to be there. Apart from that, you will also have the recorded sessions that will be available within each of the modules. So for example, if you are doing module 1, after the class, the recording will be available under module 1. If it is module 5, it will be available under module 5 and so on and so forth. Great. Now say for example, you are trying to log in and you do not receive an email. Do not worry about that. On the right hand side, there is a join class section. You should be able to click on that and open your webinar link directly. So that should not be a problem at all for you all. In case you do not get an automated email, which does not generally happen, but in case that does happen, click on this green button, join class, and you should get into GoToMeeting a webinar link directly. All right. So welcome again, friends. Welcome to the AngularJS session. You will be always on mute. In case you have any questions, please go ahead and put it in the question window. I'll take up those questions according to relevance of that particular topic at that particular point of time or towards the end of the session if it is going to kill a lot of time for others as well. Great. Just give me a second. Let me just go ahead and can you all confirm whether you're able to see my screen and hear my voice correctly? Thank you very much. Thank you all. All right. Uh, Today's is the first session, so we will dwell into a lot of basics and a little bit of concepts of JavaScript as well as AngularJS. That is the whole idea of this particular session. There might not be a lot of coding session in this particular section, but we will have a lot of coding sessions going ahead and demonstrations of how to go ahead take up AngularJS codes. Great. Like I said, this is an online class, and whenever a class ends, there will be a class recording in your LMS that you will find within each of the module in My Courses section. There will be a 24/7 support, and you should be able to go ahead ask any questions, whether technical or non-technical, to this technical support team, and they will be answered to you directly. If you have questions, you can also ask it during the session, training session. That's absolutely fine, and I'll be available to answer those questions. There will be a modular method of coverage, which starts with the least amount of complexity, and so it will start with the basics, and it will go on to the complexity of AngularJS. And after each module, you will have a quiz that you can take to to judge whether your understanding of AngularJS has been in sync and is in page with what we are doing in the sections. At the end, there'll be a project work, there'll be a deadline for the project work, and when you finish that project work within 2 weeks and you pass that project, you will be provided with a verifiable certificate with Edureka. Great. We just discussed about how to join the class. You can go ahead, log into your Edureka section, and in My Courses section on the right hand side for that particular course, you will have a join class section. That's what we just talked about. All right. Who are you speaking to? I'm Ganesh. I come with more than 10 years experience in the market, and I've been handling projects and teams for more than 6 years now. And for AngularJS, I've been working on AngularJS projects and AngularJS codes since the last 2-3 years. All right. I spoke about the class flow. The questions will be dealt towards the end of the session preferably, but however, if it is very relevant and I believe if I believe that it is very relevant to be taken during that particular time, I will go ahead and answer those questions directly. There'll be a single break after 1.5 hours. Maybe we'll have a 10-minute break. And towards the end of the session, there'll be a survey feedback. I strongly recommend you guys to go ahead and take the feedback towards the end of the session in case you want to provide, and it will help us to make changes to the session. All right, great. So what are we going to cover in AngularJS? We'll start with an introduction. We'll start with the basics of MVC, and we'll start with the basics of AngularJS. The requirement of this particular session is you need to know a little bit of JavaScript, and that's going to be enough. We will take it quite extensively, but yes, basics of JavaScript is needed for this particular session. The module 2 will talk about what are the different dependencies, how you can go ahead provide dependencies to your AngularJS application, and the different controllers associated with it. Module 3 will talk about how to create your client-side routes and nested routes for your web application. And we'll also talk about what are the inbuilt directives and filters for manipulation of your views in your application. Module 4 will talk about how to go ahead, create your own custom directives so that you can create a dynamic DOM. 5 will talk about third-party modules that will assist you in go ahead in creating your own extended application. And in case there is no feature available directly within AngularJS, you can use these third-party AngularJS modules to go ahead create an extended framework. Module 6 will be a little bit of Node, Yeoman, REST exposure. That's more of a server-side JavaScript. We'll also teach you how to go ahead create your own REST APIs. And module 7 will be about project with a mean stack, basically Mongo, Express, which is Node.js, AngularJS, and we'll also talk a little bit about LAMP, that is Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. All right, great. So let's start with the session, friends. The objectives of this session is that we'll look at what is AngularJS, why we are taking up a session with AngularJS, what's the relevance, what's the importance, and how it actually came into existence, an introduction to different types of frameworks and design patterns, maybe just an introduction. We'll talk about MVC a little bit in detail. We'll do a basic hello world example for AngularJS, and we'll do comparison of different JavaScript frameworks available in the market. All right, so let's get started. So what is AngularJS? AngularJS is basically an open source client-side framework, and it has been created by Google. When I say it's a framework, it is a framework and it's not a library. What do you technically mean by library? Library is basically a set of functions or a set of basic functionalities that are provided by an external source to your DOM that helps you do something very easily. But here in this case, AngularJS provides you the flow of creating your application. It helps you build an architecture for the application. That's the reason it's a framework. So that's the basic difference between a framework and a library. Library just extends your basic functionalities, and in case of a framework, it provides you how to go ahead architect and how to go ahead write your code in the application. It supports MVC, MVVM capabilities. It has MVVM and MVC capabilities. It basically depends on how we want to go ahead and architect the application. If you notice AngularJS basically says it's HTML enhanced for web applications. So what does AngularJS basically do? It basically enhances your HTML by adding custom tags, directives, attributes, expressions, and templates within your HTML. The way it does it is it uses JavaScript to provide dynamic content to your static DOM in such a way that your client side can be segregated and can function as a standalone application by itself. That's the whole point of using AngularJS or similar frameworks. All right. Now, what is AngularJS? AngularJS, uh, well, let's look at it this way. When you are creating a client side, I'm sure you have seen that there is HTML, there is jQuery, lot of things that makes life easier for a user to uh, interact with your server. An interactive client side web application at this particular point of time collects input from the user, updates the display, communicates with the server. In case of AngularJS, the client-side processing is done by JavaScript. It manipulates your DOM with very specific functionality that we'll talk about in future. It supports HTTP server messaging, basically your XHR requests. It does event binding and DOM manipulation. We talked about DOM manipulation. It extends through plugging. We talked about third-party support. It has built-in multi-browser support, so you should have support for AngularJS in almost all the browsers. Newer versions of browsers, Internet Explorer 8 and below, will not be supported or might be partially supported. And the basic is that it requires JavaScript. It's pure JavaScript. That's how AngularJS works. Uh, Now, what generally happens is when you are creating an HTML page that's almost static. So what does AngularJS do? AngularJS makes it a little more dynamic in terms of creating your web applications, that too client-side applications. It does a very good job in separating of concerns. It does a very good job of providing dependency injection and use it when needed. It uses different patterns. It supports a lot of patterns, so you can write your code and architect your code according to what your requirement is. So let's look at AngularJS core. AngularJS core is basically a JavaScript library framework. I mean, it's a framework, yes, but it's a file where the AngularJS core contains your basic core of AngularJS so that it provides functionality. Along with that, you will have a JQLite, which is basically a lighter version of jQuery. It's similar to jQuery, but it does not have all the components of jQuery. It has services, directives, and filters. Now, what are these services, directives, and filters? Services are basically the inbuilt services within Angular, which is $injector and $scope. We'll talk about that in detail. Directives help you manipulate and extend your DOM. Filters help you format your data. That's as simple as that. That's your core of AngularJS. You can write your applications on top of this AngularJS core and AngularJS file and go ahead, extend your DOM or create your own services or create your own functionality for the client side, and that encompasses your whole application. All right. Uh, any questions, Aline, now? Is everybody with me in this particular session? Is everybody in the same page? All right, I have a question coming in from Gopi. Gopi is saying, can you repeat directives and filters usage? Yes, Gopi. Uh, when you create an HTML page, it's basically a static page. It does not have any functionality, right? You have to use JavaScript to make it dynamic. What AngularJS provides is a component method where you can create your own directives, which helps you manipulate your DOM and provide dynamicity to your HTML page. That's what directives are. To put it simple, directives extend your functionality of your DOM elements and make it dynamic. Filters help you format your date, format your currency, put it in different formats, or do some filtering on the data. So say for example, if you have a list, maybe you might just want to order that list. Filters assist you in that particular section. All right. And services are basically your internal functionalities that help you go ahead, inject your dependencies or provide a scoped method of handling or tackling your application. We'll talk about injector and scope in detail in the next sessions, but for now, just remember these are your services which are available across your application, and you can use these to extend or create your own functionalities within your AngularJS application. All right, does that answer your question, Gopi? All right, I have a question coming in from Rajesh. Rajesh is saying, what is the difference between AngularJS and ExtensionJS? Well, at this particular point of time, AngularJS is a framework. You have to build your widgets. ExtensionJS provides pre-built widgets supporting a two-way binding. They are similar, but well, they are not. ExtensionJS is a little bit heavy in terms of the size of your client-side application. Did I answer your question, Rajesh? All right, great. I have a question coming in from Venkat. Venkat is saying, what is the difference between Node.js and AngularJS? AngularJS is very specifically client-side. You have to use it in the browser. In case of Node.js, Node.js is a server-side language built on JavaScript, built on top of JavaScript V8 engine, and it allows you to create network applications. It's not browser side, it's server side. So that's a core difference between AngularJS. All right. Gopi is asking, what is network application? Well, you have a web application, right? That's a network. That's a type of network application. All right, great. So let's go ahead and quickly look at what is separation of concerns. Uh, when you create an application, there are a lot of features. There are a lot of issues that you have to take care of, you have to handle. Most often than not, if you are not segregating your code, if you're not creating a clean code, what happens is they get jumbled up and you have an issue creating the architecture or maintaining that particular application. So most of these design patterns that we'll be talking about going forward, like MVC, MVVM, what they do is they say divide your concerns, divide your functionality, divide your issues in such a way that they are separate, isolated, independent issues or independent concerns. Divide and rule is what we are doing here. And in this particular case, when you divide, it's very easy to do parallel development because each are independent of each other. It's very easy to maintain them. So that's the whole idea of separation of concerns. And it's very easy that way to maintain it because now they are independent sections. And since they are independent sections, you can test them easily, right? So that's the whole point of separation of concerns, and AngularJS helps very much with it. Even a beginner with AngularJS and JavaScript will have a good segregation of code, and that's the whole idea of using AngularJS. Great. We have already seen some of the reasons why we are using AngularJS. Uh, One, it provides a platform to write client-side applications using using JavaScript, and it does that in a very structured way. Like I said, even a beginner would be segregating the code quite well. That's how the framework of AngularJS is, and it helps you to go ahead use established MVC, MVVM patterns that are available in the market. Now, I talked something new here, MVC and MVVM. I'm quite sure a lot of people might be using that already. But before talking about this, I would surely want to understand the level of understanding that you all have. Can you all, in the question window, also ping me your experience and your hands-on with JavaScript and the details that you have worked on in terms of JavaScript applications? That will be helpful for me to understand that. So I see a mix of experienced as well as non-experienced developers here with JavaScript. That's what I'm seeing here. I will cover and brush through MVC as a starter, and of course, in case you want to go ahead get into more details, we'll also provide you references for that. Don't worry about that. A basic understanding of JavaScript is more than enough for this particular session. All right, great. We have talked about separation of concern. When you divide your application into different sections and into maybe by using design patterns like MVC and MVVM or MVP, what basically happens is you are segregating some amount of code that can be used across all the application sections. So say for example, there might be an HTTP request that you make time and again. You might want to make a separate code layer just for HTTP and then use it again and again across all your sections. That's what AngularJS makes it easy. Since it allows you to go ahead, design your application with different patterns, and it makes it a breeze to do that. Basically MVC or VM or MVP. It helps you segregate code which is redundant, make it into a single library or a single module, and reuse it across your application. So that's what AngularJS helps you with, and it's very easy to go ahead do that with AngularJS. We'll see that over the course of our sessions. AngularJS is cross browser compliant, and other than Internet Explorer 8 and below, where you might have to use some shins or do away with some functionalities, AngularJS works perfectly okay. It provides a data binding capability for rich client-side applications, and it supports two-way binding, which means that the updating happens automatically. All right, we'll talk about two-way binding, so don't get into the details of two-way binding right away. You will a lot of your questions will be answered as soon as we get into different sections of AngularJS sessions. All right, it's very actively maintained by Google and it's open source. Great. So I had put forward a question for details of your experience and your hands-on with JavaScript. This is the reason I was doing that. Now let's talk about it in a little more detail. Whenever we are developing a web application, there are a lot of challenges. Challenges which come from multiple devices, access from multiple devices, user preferences. Maybe they might want to view data as a table. Some people might want to view data as a chart or so on and so forth. The skill sets that are available to you when developing that particular application, and the agility to go ahead and process new requests from your client. That is the most common case scenario that happens for developers nowadays. What happens is, if your device is not ready to accept the structure that you have, you are in a catch-22 situation. You might have to write code again and again for each of the device that is accessing your application. So what MVC does and what AngularJS helps you with is, it helps you provide a common interface of interaction which allows any device to connect and use it, and according to the device it will change its views. That's what it MVC does, and that's what AngularJS helps you with. User preferences with AngularJS, and by segregating code or using design patterns like MVC, you would be able to go ahead create different views, and according to different views selected by the user, you should be able to provide those views to people, views to the user. A graphic designer might not be equivalent to a front-end developer, might not be equivalent to a back-end developer. When you create an MVC structure or segregated application layers for your model, your views and your controllers, or when you segregate your code so that your issues are segregated, your graphic designer might not want to depend on your front-end developer, might not want to depend on your back-end developer. So what happens is, your graphic designer can do his designing independent of what the front-end developer is going to do, and the front-end developer can design or create his front-end UI independent of what your back-end developer is going to do. So that's one of the most important aspect of handling an application and the development accordingly. With MVC, since the concerns are separated, they are in different sections. By changing only one section, you can change almost the entire application or the new provide new features for your client. That's what MVC basically does. And I have been talking about MVC so often, so continuously, and we have been talking about challenges with a lot of assumptions in mind. Let's actually look at what MVC is. Great. So JavaScript MVC framework. Let's understand one thing. When you create an application, your application is your server-side code plus your browser code. That's what is for a web application. Model connects to your database or is an interface to connect to your database. View is what the user interacts with. Example, your browser. Controller is basically what decides who talks to the UI and who talks to the database. That's as simple as it. The controller decides your interaction between the view and the model. If user 1 is not eligible to talk to the database or the model, controller will decide no. If the user is eligible, the controller decides yes. And most often, scenarios, what happens is the controller decides what view is shown to the user. So it basically is something like this. There is a view which talks to the controller, and the controller talks to the model, which is the database or your data. If the user requires any kind of data, it is sent to the controller. The controller decides whether the user can see it or not. If the user can see it, it sends it to the database, gets those details from the database or the model, and sends it back. Was that simple enough? Was that structure very clear? Because that's what we are going to use as a base to explain things ahead. I have a few responses. Can I have responses from everyone? All right, fantastic. Let's take a case of a web application. In your web application, you have, say, for example, a Java code or a PHP code. One part of the Java code or the PHP code talks to the database. The one that talks to the database or the interface that talks to the database becomes your model. One creates views and sends the HTML pages to the user, that becomes your controller, and decides what actions are to happen. That's your controller. And whatever is seen by your browser is your views. Okay, that's the whole point of MVC. It separates who sees what and who does what. In case of a MVC pattern, user actions like click of a button, submit of a form goes to the controller. It is notified to the model. In case there is an database action required, the model talks to the database, gets the data and updates the controller, and the update is sent back. Specifically, in case of MVC, you might have model updating the view directly. The controller provides the action from the view, but that it might happen that the model will update the views directly. So you might have the view going, view action going from view to controller, controller to model, but instead of the model responding to the controller, you might have the model responding to the view directly. That can also be possible in an MVC. So remember this particular feature in case of MVC. I'll give you an example. When you click on a page, it goes to the controller in the server. The server decides whether the form has to be submitted. If the form is submitted, it goes back, enters the data in the form, and it goes to the next route. There is no data provided back. So there is no interaction with the model here, nor with the controller, but the controller is deciding what route to show. The controller is still deciding what route to show. So the controller decides what the user sees. But there might be cases where it requests for some data from the table. So view clicks on a particular link, it goes to the controller. The controller says that okay, the user wants to see a table from the database. It sends a request to the model. The model fetches data from the database, and model updates the view directly with the data that is needed for your view. The only thing that the controller at this particular point of time is controlling is what view should to be shown, whether the data has to be shown as a chart or the data has to be shown as a table. All right, this is how MVC is segregated, and the advantage is that you are separating your model from the view. Now you have a separate model and a separate view. The only thing that now you have to worry about is who is doing what and how the interaction is happening. So it is easy to add multiple data presentations for the same data. Like I said, the data might be tabular or the data might be in charts. It facilitates adding new types of data presentation as technology develops. So maybe you might have two different views depending on your application requirements. So it facilitates adding new types very easily. You just have to take the data and format it in a different view type. Model and view components are very independent and can vary independently, enhancing maintainability, extendability, and testability. All right. Since they are different, they are not dependent on each other. They can change separately. The only thing that the view has to worry about is it has to be in a specific format. The only thing the model has to worry about is the data sent back has to be in a very specific format. That's all. Great. I have a question for you. AngularJS is not a library, so we cannot use any cool features or functions of libraries like jQuery. Is that correct? All right, I have a response from somebody saying no, somebody saying yes. Great. I'll answer that question. The answer is yes, you can use using jQuery Lite. Remember, I told you you have jQuery Lite, which is a subset of jQuery. And if you still want to use all the features of jQuery, you can just go ahead and add jQuery in, and you should be able to use both of them. Remember, I told you AngularJS is a framework. It allows you to extend your application. So if you want more features of jQuery that is not within AngularJS, you can still add jQuery and use it. Right? There is a question from Gopi. He's saying, is controller at the server side? Uh, well, Gopi, I want to answer that question very specifically. When you create applications, you can create an application with MVC structure or MVVM structure entirely. What AngularJS helps is when you say, for example, create an MVC application, the view part can be taken out, isolated, and you can divide your view part into MVC, MVVM, and so on and so forth. So technically what would happen is you will have a model and a controller in server side and an MVC pattern in the client side, because the client or the view is now completely independent of your server side code. Does that answer your question very clearly? Okay. Gopi says no. Gopi, can you extend your question in that particular case? I have a question coming in from Ravi. Ravi is asking the difference between MVVM and MVC. We'll talk about that soon. Gopi, I'm waiting for your question. Can you be a little more specific what you're looking at? All right. Great. I have, quite a bit of follow-up questions. Let me do one thing. For the benefit of understanding, let me take, it's not going to be 100% exact, but let me explain this in a fashion that might make a little more sense. If you notice this particular section, I hope you guys might be able to now relate to what model view controller is. Model talks to the database. Controller is your controller that talks to the model and the view and communicates actions from view to model and updates from model to the view. That's absolutely clear, right? Can I have a confirmation? Okay, fantastic. Now I say that I am going to use Angular. AngularJS says that apart from this particular model that we have, I will go ahead help you create applications that will be a client-side MVC. Does that make more sense? So technically what's happening is you have the user who is talking to the view. There is communication from, let me take, when the user creates events by button press, submit, or maybe entry into the input form. The view from AngularJS talks to the controller. The controller sends information to the model, and that is sent to your controller here. Does that make sense? So this is what is technically happening in your system now. Before it was a model view controller, but remember the fundamentals of model view controller. Model talks to the database, or model talks to the data. Controller takes care of your interaction with the model, and view is the one that your user is seeing. AngularJS goes one step ahead, says I'll provide you a framework for your client-side application where your view is going to be very thin, your controller is going to be very thin, does not have any business logic other than some logic of the routes and formatting of data, and fetches all the data from your controller, which acts as a model for this particular application. Okay, so this is how your structure is going to be. Does that answer your question, Gopi? Whether it's a client side controller or server side controller. Okay, thank you very much. Whether you are using a client side MVC or complete application MVC, always remember controller is the one that provides what data to be fetched. In case of MVC, the model might send the data. I put that in quotes. Model might send the data directly to the view. But most often than not, applications handle the sending of data and updating of the data from the controllers. Okay, it's not a hard and fast rule. It basically depends on your application requirement and the architecture. Now comes my question. How does MVC solve the challenge of users preferring different device types like PCs, mobile phones, etc.? Is it the first, view is separated from the controller? Is the second, view can adapt to different devices? Third, model remains unchanged? Fourth, all of the above. Anybody wants to take that question? All right. I have a 2 from Venkat. I have a 4 from Hemlata, 4 from Aparna, 4 from Sitaram, and Ravi. Rajesh says all of the above. All right. The answer is all of the above. Great. I had a question about MVVM. Let's actually get into MVVM. The difference is not much. It's a very minor difference. It's also if you go and ask a lot of people will say it's a flavor of MVC. A lot of people will say it's a different framework altogether. It's a different design pattern altogether. The MVC pattern separates it into 3 sections, right? Model, view, and controller. In this case, what happens is there are also 3 concerns. The model is there, the view is there. However, instead of the controller, there will be a view and a model. The controller is now replaced with a view and a model. So what technically is happening is, in case of MVC, I told you that there might be possibilities that model updates the view directly. But in this particular case, whatever the reason, what come may, the model has to respond or update the data back to the view model, and the view model sends it or updates it to the view using data binding. That's the first core difference. So I'll tell you something. You have the view. View has an interface that talks to the something similar to a controller. The controller talks to the model. The model will not update the view directly at all. It has to send it back to the controller. Now, in this particular case, the controller is the view model, and that sends data back using data binding methods and updates the view. It's a very strong relationship. The view is isolated from the model. View model does not manipulate controls directly, which means that it does not create any controls like triggering off a button click or triggering off a submit form. Nothing. It's entirely with the view. The user controls it. But the view model compulsorily takes care of the interaction between the model and the view. The model in this particular section does not talk to the view directly in any circumstances. All right, great. I have a question coming in from Aparna. Aparna is saying, what is model remains unchanged? Can you, can you be a little more specific here? I was not able to comprehend the question. All right, I have questions coming in, as part questions. I strongly recommend everyone to put the whole question in one question box, because what's happening is I have too many people responding continuously, and your question, I will not be able to answer your question if your question gets split across 2 or 3 different, question windows. All right. Venkat is asking, what is the disadvantage? Well, there is no advantage or disadvantage. It's just your context of where you're going to use it. All right. That was the answer for Venkat's question of what's the disadvantage or what's the advantage. In case of another question that's coming in from Ravi saying, can you repeat, once more? Yes, sure. I will be getting into MVVM details again. Um, Great. I will go ahead and the view talks to the controller talks to the model talks to the controller, and it is sent back to the view. However, there might be scenarios when the model talks to the view directly or updates the data directly to the view. All right. So this is model view controller. In case of view, what happens is the user controls clicking off, a button, submit, everything is going to be in the view, but the view is going to be thin. The view talks to the view model. The view model talks to the model. View model sends the data back to view model, and the view model sends it back to the view. That is one difference. It is compulsorily an interface for interaction between view and model. That is the first difference. The second difference, when you have a view here in MVVP, what happens is that in many scenarios, there is an interface that talks to the view model, and there is an interface that talks to the model. So you can presume your in view model this to be the model, this interface to be the model, and in case of the view, this interface to be the view section. All right, there is an interface. That's the best example I can give you. Is instead of the controller having just the business logic, now there is an interface that any functionality from the view, all right, is now transferred to the interface in view model. Functionality, say for example, if there is a function in JavaScript, that will become part of view model. If there is a function in controller that talks to the database or the model, that becomes the model in the view model. Does that make sense? The views become very thin with no functionality. The only thing that they do is they just display data. That's all. What was that? Did that answer your question, Aparna and Ravi? Aparna had asked, does the model remain unchanged? Yes, the model remains unchanged in whatever scenario. Great. Let me give you a third point, which is also a difference between MVC and MVVM. Though it is quite a lot contested, view model also takes care of your business logic. There is no business logic in the view at all. There is no data manipulation logic in the model at all. The only thing the model interface does is takes data from the database, converts it to required format and sends it back. The view model is the one that takes care of what has to be shown to the view. Because view model takes care of updating of the data and it sends the data in whatever prescribed format, view model also adheres to one point, that the view model is not does not have the knowledge of which view is there. Remember, I told you the controller decides what view has to be shown. The view model does only one thing: formats the data and updates the view. But the view model does not know what view is presented. That's one of the biggest difference between your view model, MVVM and MVC. But in case of MVC, the controller decides what view has to be shown to the user. Does that make a little more sense now? Great. So again, let's go ahead and get back to our section. Now let's look at the same view model structure. There is a model, there's a view model, there is a view. View model, like I said, it changes the format, shows what format has shown. It keeps a track of what format has been sent, keeps a track of what are the details in the view, because the view is thin, right? The view is thin. The only thing that the view does is it binds the data, sends and receives events. Events might be user clicks, submit of form, getting of data, anything. All right. But view model is a compulsory interface between model and view. The model does not update the view directly. However, in case of view model, the view model does not decide what view is shown to the user at all. Though it keeps track of what data has been sent, what is the state of that particular data that was being sent. All right, so that comes to our next slide of MVVM views. It represents the user interface that the user will see, all right, though it is very thin. It has the controls like triggering of events. It has the or it is a data template, maybe a static data template. It does not contain any logic. Remember I told you there is an interface in view model. That interface takes off all the logic of the views. Maybe on click send an ajax request, on click send an http request. That logic now gets into the view model. The view is very simple as possible, so that you can now go ahead test your logic separately. In case of MVVM, the view model is an abstraction of the view. It's not the complete view, but it's an abstraction of the view. It connects compulsorily the view and the model. There is no bypass here. Maintains the view state and maintains how the value is going to be converted, and takes care of the value conversion. It triggers events in the view. It can trigger for updating. It triggers the events in the view, and the data binding takes care of binding of the data. Make view model as testable as possible. That's what the whole idea is. Because now there is no functionality in the view, or almost very little functionality in the view, your view model becomes an independent structure by itself, not controlling the view, no interaction with the view in the view, and it being independent, you can test it much better. The unit test for view model would be much better. All right, so this was about your view model, but the model does not change. The logic of data manipulation still stays with the model. The interface of model still stays with the model. The business rules of the data, which means what format to send back or what data to send back, and it represents the data basically. There are a lot of cases where people have developed application by using REST services of database directly. That might be an exception to the case of MVC or MVVM, because now you're skipping your view model or controller directly. Just search for or look for REST APIs of SQL database or MongoDB database, where the REST API is directly the database. There is no controller in between. So that might be just one exception to this particular case here. Other than that, the model is basically the layer that talks to your database. All right, fantastic. I have a very good question coming in from Ravi, though it's a very basic one. When user click event happens, all right, when user click event, the how view model know that click event occurred. All right, I believe the question is when the user click happens, how does the view model know that the click event occurred? Right, I was talking about an interface. That is the interface that might be a JavaScript interface, or maybe a different interface in case of a different application that takes care of understanding that. It is by default taken care of by your browser, and the browser takes care of how that event is sent to the view model. You don't have to worry about that. In many of the scenarios, when you're creating web applications, you really don't have to worry whether uh, uh, you have to find when the user clicked on that particular event. That is a default functionality of the browser, and that's one of the reasons why we consider browser as a part of your view. Gopi has another question. In RESTful applications, will MVVM be not available? Uh, uh, Gopi, I want to answer your question with a yes or a no. Uh, in MVVM, in RESTful applications, MVVM or MVC, both are available. It depends on how you architect your application. Does that answer your question, Gopi? Whether it is MVC or whether it's MVVM in RESTful application, you can you can create a RESTful application irrespective of your structure. It just depends on how you architect it. All right. Gopi is asking, I want to repeat something you said about RESTful 2 minutes back. All right. Let me show you something for you to make sense of. All right. What happens? I pointed out that there is a exception where you might not really have a controller and where your view directly talks to the model. This is the exception I was talking about. There is an option in MySQL. There is a plugin where if you use that plugin through HTTP interface, you can send your SQL statements directly and get the response. This is the exception I was talking about. You can create a REST API or a REST response directly from your database. So what technically happens is the view is triggering an SQL statement directly from the view to the model. There is no controller in between. This was the exception I was talking about. Does that make sense to everyone? Ravi, did that answer your question about a RESTful point that I discussed about? Thank you, Ravi. All right, let's get back to our. Now, I have a question for you all. I have heard that AngularJS is MVW framework. Uh, has anybody heard of MVW framework? I mean, anybody who might have heard of MVW framework? Great. I have a response from Sitaram. Sitaram says it's MV model view whatever. True. Model view whatever means that whether it's model view controller or model view model or MVP or whatever structure you have or whatever architecture you have as a design for your application, AngularJS supports it. The whole idea is AngularJS uh, is a framework that gives you a model view star or whatever option to create your client-side applications. Okay, great. Let's look at AngularJS architecture. I told you HTML is static. Yes, HTML is always going to be static. The little amount of dynamism or the dynamic options that you get with HTML is because of your JavaScript. In AngularJS, you have an HTML page, you have static DOM. AngularJS takes the events from your static DOM, which is triggered by the browser, and processes it. It processes it in such a way that the processing results in a dynamic DOM, a DOM which can interact with the user and can be very interactive in some cases. How does AngularJS do that? AngularJS bootstraps or initializes an application with something called as ng-app. ng-app is the one that identifies your application in your DOM. It uses a service internally, a function basically, which injects or provides a root scope basically to scope your application to provide you have worked with scopes, right? So it provides it scopes the application and then it takes the DOM and compiles it into a dynamic DOM. That's what it basically does. There are quite a few services within your AngularJS. The injector injects it, associates it with the root scope, and both of them together are compiled using a compile service, and it is given back as a dynamic DOM. That's what it basically does. I have a question from Gopi. He's asking what is DOM. DOM is basically your browser document object model. So it is uh, it's basically your document in your browser. That's the simplest way I can put it as. If there is an HTML, the HTML is rendered in the browser. That particular rendering is rendered as objects, and that's basically your document object. And that's what your browser uses to identify or trigger events or receive events. Okay. I have a question from Sitaram Chaudhary. Sitaram says, can you explain in detail about the injector? Yes, we will be talking about the injector and dependency injection in detail, but that will not be today. We'll have that in the next sessions. For the benefit of everyone here, because there will be some people who are new, so I would be doing that in a step-by-step fashion, and I'm not talking about that because that's a whole topic by itself. Great. So I told you AngularJS is basically an framework. It's kind of available as an AngularJS JavaScript and JavaScript file, and you go ahead and start the application using ng app. You identify what interaction is to be associated using ng controller, and what data has to be presented is provided by ng model. Okay, I'll repeat it again. You start the application or identify the application using ng app tag. You identify what functionality to be given to that particular DOM using ng controller. You identify what data or what value to be loaded using ng model. We'll look at it in some detail in a minute's time. Just give me a minute or a slide or two. Okay. Every application every application will work well only if there are scoped items, which means that if there is a function, whatever within the function should be within it and should not get hoisted or pushed outside that particular function. If you declare a variable within a function, it needs to be scoped within that particular function. Similarly, in an application, if you create you know a DOM snippet, a dynamic DOM snippet, and associate a controller, what's the use of that particular DOM snippet if the items are accessible out of that particular snippet? It makes your development difficult, right? So that's what the scope is all about. The scope is basically passed as a parameter, and this is basically the identifier or the restrictive factor for your controller to function and isolate your scopes within that dynamic snippet. Okay, so let's go ahead. Before going into any of the other slides, let's quickly go ahead and start your what I'm doing right now is I'm going to create a single HTML page, and before I continue, you can use any editor. I'm using, at times I'm using NetBeans, at times I'm using Visual Studio Code. If you're comfortable with any other editor or any other IDE, it's absolutely fine. You can use it. All right. It's not a hard and fast rule. And when you're working with your editors, make sure that you're comfortable with your editors and the shortcuts. It will, improve your development very much. That's the whole point here. I'm using at this particular point of time Visual Studio Code, which is kind of very good. That's what I found. You can use that, or you can use any other options available in the market. Okay, great. So let me quickly go to a website called as AngularJS.org. This is where you will be able to download your versions of AngularJS. Pick up the latest version. If you click on the download section here in this particular page, you will download the minimum version as minified version, as well as the development version together. And you should be able to go ahead, look at the developer guide, which is quite detailed and pretty good. It will get you started with your different sections that is there in AngularJS, or you can get into API reference to get into the actual API that is provided by AngularJS. Okay, so this is where your documentation stays. Your documentation is going to be your guide going forward. And I strongly recommend, if you're not comfortable using documentation, I strongly recommend please go through the documentation and get comfortable with the documentation, because that's what makes a big difference, whenever there are version changes and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is where you will get your AngularJS code. I have my AngularJS code right within my library. I have kept it as angular.main.js. Let me go ahead. Okay, add it in my HTML page. Uh, that's about it. You are ready to use your AngularJS application. Now you just have to go ahead and start creating your application. I told you AngularJS is JavaScript, right? So there are two different ways to add JavaScript in your HTML page. One is within the script tag, or one is adding your JavaScript through your source file. I hope everyone is aware of that. Now that we have included our AngularJS main file here, let me go ahead and start the bootstrap or initialize the AngularJS application. You'll start with something called as ng-app. ng-app is nothing but an attribute that is provided with HTML5. It's something similar to the bind function, bind attribute, and you can either write bind-ng-app, or you can avoid that bind and directly write ng-app. This is your identifier. So if you write ng-app on the top of the page or in the HTML tag, your whole HTML file is going to be your application, and that is going to be the scope of the application. However, if you go ahead and create a div and mention ng-app within the div, your application will get restricted within the div tags. I hope that is absolutely clear with everyone. This is how you start or initialize the AngularJS application. This is how AngularJS identifies that where the application starts and where the application ends. The application ends where the tag ends. Does that make sense? Everybody in sync with me? Great. I prefer to have the HTML page as the initializer. Remember, one HTML page can have only one ng app. If you define two ng apps in an HTML page, the second will be ignored, or there will be some other issues that will occur because of scopes within. All right, but always remember the first is the one that is going to be bootstrapped or initialized. Okay, let me quickly go and define a variable called as application where app, and I'll define something called as angular.module. Now angular.module is the way you define a module within AngularJS application. There are two arguments you pass to the module. One is the name of the app, okay, and the second is dependencies. I will not talk about dependencies right now. Dependencies are basically any third party or your own created dependency for the module. It might be jQuery, it might be some other router, it might be some kind of library that you have created as a module for Angular. All right. Again, I do not want any dependency here, so I'm going to keep it as a blank array. It's always going to be an array of items. So if you have a dependency, you're going to add dependency 1, comma, dependency 2, and so on and so forth. At this particular point of time, it's just a hello world and our starting session. I'm going to remove this. There are no dependency that I'm going to use. All right. So you have initialized your app where app is equal to angular.module and the name of the app and the dependency. Remember, if you want to bootstrap or initialize your application correctly, you have to have the name which is same as ng-app. Otherwise, your ng-app is not going to be identified. ng-app is an identifier for the module identifier. So if you have a different name and that particular module is not defined, your application is not going to be bootstrapped or identified. All right. Now, since this is an object, I'm going to go ahead, create a controller, and the controller again takes two things. The first thing is name of the controller, first CTRL. The second is a callback function. I'll repeat it again. App.controller is the method or the way you define a controller in AngularJS. When you say app.controller, it basically means Angular module dot controller. But since we have assigned it to app variable, we are using the app variable here. You could also go ahead, remove the semicolon, and extend it directly like this. This should work. However, for ease of understanding and segregation of objects well, I'm going to use this. Okay, great. So I have a quick question coming in from Sita Ram, and he is asking, can we add multiple identifiers for ng app like demo1, demo2, and so on? Sitaram, I think I mentioned there can be only one ng app in one HTML page. You can have only one. This is a single page application, so you can have only one ng app in one HTML page. If you want demo1, demo2, and so on and so forth, you have to have two different HTML pages or two different applications. But there are methods in which you can segregate two modules. We'll talk about that in the detailed sections of creating your own modules. That will be very much later. But remember, at this particular point of time for you, since it's an introduction session, remember there can be only one application, ng app, in one HTML page. Okay, great. Now that I have put my controller, I need to know, or I need to specify the scope, right? The first thing is I need to specify which section takes the controller that we are creating. Okay, it can be the body. It's a bad idea, but because the whole body will become your controller, because you can have multiple controllers. I can go ahead and create another controller which can be named second CTRL. It's basically a convention. If you notice, I'm using CTRL at the end. It's not. You can just mention SEC and it should work fine. Okay. The reason I'm mentioning CTRL is just a convention to identify that it's a controller, and it's a convention that's used across by all the developers. You can create a second controller. You can go ahead and define it separately. But remember, every controller has to be different. Otherwise, there will be a problem of identifying which controller has to be used. If you use two controllers in your DOM element and both have the same name, both will be applied with the same controller. Okay. What I mean by it is, if I use for CTRL for both, then the div1 and the div2 both will be assigned with the first controller only, and that's going to be a bad practice again for your basic HTML. There are ways where it is beneficial. We'll talk about that later, and that will come into directives. All right. I have a quick question coming in from Gopi. Gopi is asking, why do we need controllers? Great question. Controllers are the one that takes care of your functionality for the DOM. Remember, I told you this DOM is static. We are going to create all the functionality. We are going to provide all the data from within the controller, right? You can have multiple controllers. Multiple controllers, basically, first might be a form. You might have a form here. You might have a data list here, and a data controller might attach to maybe the second controller, and the form controller might attach to the first controller, and so on and so forth. That's the reason why you can have or might use multiple controllers, right? Great. So now we have to go ahead and scope this particular controller. There are multiple ways of scoping the controller, but to start up with, the first thing you need to do is, to scope a controller, you pass scope, and on the scope you define your model. It is not basically a model, but it's a variable that references the data. Okay, so scope.model name is going to be some value. It might be an object, it might be a string, it might be a number, it might be an array, anything. Now that we have the model ready, we have something called as an expression. Remember, an expression is nothing but a normal JavaScript expression. And in the HTML template, you put it within two flower brackets. And let me copy the model name here. Now your data is bound to your div. Okay. So the reference of this model name is a direct reference to this. Remember that reference will work only when you have a first CTR. Okay. So this reference is very important. The controller reference is the one that is going to be the identifier for this particular expression that is there. Let's go ahead and quickly run this particular demo. I have an error that's coming here. So let me just check what is the error. Okay. So if you notice, the error was basically /live. So remember, your pathing has to be correct. Your typos should not be there. Uh, uh, when I was debugging this particular error, the first things that I was doing was I checked whether the names are right. Okay. The next I checked was whether the pathing is right and whether the initialization is right. With this kind of initialization, a correct initialization, you should be able to work well. And if you notice, the test is printed here, and the test is nothing but the data that has been binded to by model name. Okay, so that's your hello world, and that's how you start an application. Let's go ahead with some quick questions here. I have a question coming in from Gopi. Gopi is saying multiple controllers, one is also okay, right? Right, Gopi, one is also okay. However, it's a nice idea to go ahead, segregate your application sections and have different controllers for different sections. Does that make sense, Gopi? Okay, thank you, Gopi. I have a question from Ravi. Ravi is saying if I go ahead and put $scope 2 and request for this, what will happen? Okay, I want everybody to understand that scope is a service within AngularJS, right? So it has to be identified as scope. There will be nothing like scope 2. But for the benefit of the whole class, let me do one thing. Let me open the debugger. Let me go to the console and refresh the page. If you notice, it says there is an injector error. Quite rightly so, because there is an injector error of scope 2. There is nothing called a scope 2. If I remove this and remove this, it should work. However, there is a clause. I have defined model name twice. Can anybody tell me what will happen when I define model name twice? Which is the value that is going to be printed? Sitaram says test 2. Anybody else? I believe it's test 1. What does everyone else think? Aparna says test. Gopi says test 2. Hema says test 2. Okay, great. Let me explain this very specifically. We will cover in detail tomorrow. That's a topic for tomorrow. And a function runs from top to bottom, and this is how the callback function will also run. It will go from top to bottom. It will assign it to model name test, but then it sees model name again. It will assign it test 2. Okay, so your result should technically be test 2. All right, so that's a basic idea of JavaScript. JavaScript runs asynchronously from top to bottom, and that's how this particular variable assignation will also be assigned. So it will be test 2. Whatever scope, in case of scope or in case of a callback function, whatever in sequence will be triggered from top to bottom. There are some specific cases where it might not be, and that is due to the asynchronous nature of JavaScript, but we'll talk about that in detail later also. But remember, if there are two variables with the same name, you'll be assigned the second one. Okay, great. That was the hello world. Before we get into the slides, I believe let's take a quick break, and we'll take a break for maybe 10 minutes and come back. I have a question coming in from Aparna. Aparna is saying because the dependency is only scope. No, Aparna, it's not because of the dependency of scope. It is because of the way JavaScript is. If you assign two variables with the same name, even in a normal function, let me give an example. Let me say that, function, whatever, this is a normal, function. And if I say where variable is equal to maybe where, and if I go ahead and assign it again with where2, JavaScript will assign where2 as the uh, value for variable. That's how JavaScript is. This is not something related to scope at all. It's pure JavaScript, and that's how it's supposed to work. Great. I have a question coming in from Ravi. Ravi says scope name literally predefined by Angular. Yes, it's a literal service provided by Angular, and it has to be scope all the time. There are methods in which you can avoid scope injection or scope attribute. We'll talk about it later. But at this particular point of time, remember you have to inject scope, and it's a literal name. It's not within quotes. It's a direct name that you provide. All right, Aparna. Okay, great. No issues. Let's take a quick break. It's 9:40 right now. Let's come back by 9:50, and let's continue with our session today. Okay, so see you after 10 minutes. So now let's come back to the structure. If you notice, HTML is still static. What we did was we added AngularJS. We initialized the application using the name, and in this particular case we used it as demo. We knowingly unknowingly used $injector. It's happening behind the scenes. That's the whole point of it. And we injected scope. I will talk about root scope in detail tomorrow, and maybe touch upon it later in today's class. But what technically happened was, when you created your controller, you injected your scope. It was taken together with your DOM, and it compiled it to make a dynamic DOM. And whatever model or whatever variable that you had assigned to the scope was assigned to your static HTML dynamically. This provides you an option to go ahead, change your variables dynamically from your JavaScript. So that's the whole point of AngularJS. It makes it a little more dynamic, and we'll see how we can make it even more dynamic when we go ahead in our sessions. We initialize the application using ng-app. We did see that. We created a controller called as ng-controller, and we defined a model as a variable for $scope. right? That's what we did for ng controller, and we assigned the ng controller to a div, and the name of that controller was similar to the name of the Angular dot controller that we defined in our example. Okay, ng model is something that I'll touch upon in a minute's time, but remember ng model is almost similar to the variable name that is there. I'll actually take it right now. Say for example, if you have a controller here and I go ahead and create a div here, instead of the variable here, if I go ahead and use ng dash model equal to this, should also go ahead and assign the model to the div. Let's go back, refresh. Sorry about that. Really sorry about that. It printed test2. I'll tell you why I used ngbind instead of ngmodel in tomorrow's class. Okay, but at this particular point of time, remember that it's binding the ng model called as model name to this particular div. All right. In case I'm using an input tag, all right, and I provide ng model equal to model name. In this particular scenario, if I go back and refresh, I'll get an input box with the value assigned as test2. That's what ng model is. Ng model and ng bind are basically the ones that bind your model or your variable assigned to the $scope to that particular tag. All right, so that's what your ng model basically does. It will load the value to that particular div tag or that particular tag to make it dynamic. I have a question coming in from Venkat. Venkat is saying, can you repeat it? Yes, for sure, I can do that. If instead of, remember I told you we use expressions. Expressions is nothing but your binding of your variables. If I do model name here, it will print that particular variable. Is that correct? Instead of that, I can go ahead and assign a ng bind to that particular tag, and it will bind the model name to the div tag. It's not necessary to use div. You can go ahead use span as well, or you can go ahead use any other element that is provided by HTML, and it will bind this particular model or the variable of scope to this particular div tag. All right. The second option is if you're using input tags or text area or whatever, you can assign that particular model directly using that particular model name. If you notice, model name is here, model name is here. To assign it directly to tags like input, use ng-model and it should assign it directly to this particular tag. All right. So this is how ng-bind and ng-model work. The another option is expressions, like I told you. Okay. Does that answer your question, Venkat? Okay, great. ng controller. So we saw scope. We passed the scope as a parameter. This parameter is mandatory and others are optional, right? Module loading. We saw angular.module, how we created a module and provided a name. The name has to be same as your application. And the application name is going to be the ng-app name that you provide. Services are also passed as parameters. We'll see that later. $HTTP is also an example of a service. which provides XHR request or AJAX request, like in jQuery, that is also passed as a parameter. So along with scope, if you want to do AJAX, add your $HTTP. What I technically mean is, if you want to go ahead and do an HTTP request, just go ahead, add HTTP request and call the HTTP request with whatever methods. We'll talk about the whatever methods later, so as to not confuse. But at this particular point of time, if you want to add a dependency of HTTP service, you have to add it out here. Okay, that's what your slide means. Okay, expressions. Let's look at expressions in a little detail. AngularJS expressions inserts model directly into the view. We saw that. We put the model within the expression flower brackets, two flower brackets, and it was printed to the view. It is similar to JavaScript with a few differences, which means any JavaScript expression can be evaluated within those flower brackets. 1 plus 1 will also be evaluated. 1 plus 2 will also be evaluated. If you pass a string, the string also will be put there, but it cannot take functions. What I mean by that is, when you are using expressions, if I go ahead, put 1 plus 2, which is an expression, correct? It will provide me 3 because 1 plus 2 is an expression. I can go ahead and make it string. It will give me 12 because that's how JavaScript evaluates that particular expression. However, I cannot go ahead and put a function within here. Just remember that. This particular expression is not capable of taking a function. It is very similar to JavaScript, but it takes only expressions. It does not take functions. It has to be an expression or a variable that is assigned to it. All right. It handles undefined and null errors gracefully, which means that if instead of having the model name equal to text, if you assign model name equal to a blank variable, or if it is not defined, it will not throw an error. It will just not print anything. Handling these errors gracefully. Does not use JavaScript eval, instead uses $parse. It's a bad practice across in the JavaScript community, and they say avoid using eval unless you really need it. AngularJS provides you $parse service if you ever need to use JavaScript.eval function. Okay. Models. Models are implemented using $scope. We saw that. Any variable assigned to a model is going to be, any variable assigned to a scope is going to be your model. Your models are capable of storing, handling data. $scope dot your new value property is equal to value is what the definition is going to be. It's a JavaScript object like normal objects. It contains data and methods. So instead of going ahead and providing a value to this, what you can technically do is you can assign a function to a model, and then maybe some activity going on here. Okay, and what you can do is you can use that particular function don't ask me about ngClick. We'll have that section in detail. But what we can go ahead and do is we can call that particular function from your HTML directly. So we saw different methods of defining models. We saw we can have a string, we can have an object, we can have a number, and we can have a function as well. It depends on what context you need that particular model definition and what functionality you want that particular model to push into your DOM. Okay? It can have its own properties. It can add its own properties. So, say for example, you can have a scope.model, which is a JavaScript object which has a key value pair. Great. I have a quick question coming in, and the question is from Ravi. Ravi is saying, where do we need to use ngBind and ngModel? Is there any difference? When do we use either one? In case of span, where you want to print the model to the span, you will use ngBind. You can also use ngBind with your input value, but in that particular case, you will have to use an expression. In case of ngModel, you will use in places where you can bind that model directly to that input tag or a text area and so on and so forth. That's the basic usages of ngModel and ngBind. Did that answer your question, Ravi? Gopi, can you specify which slide you want me to repeat? I would do that. Sitaram has a question. Does it mean even if I do not define variable, uh, it does not throw an error? You are right, Sitaram. Even if you do not define a variable and you use an expression to print that variable, and since that variable is not defined, it should actually throw undefined. But AngularJS handles it better. AngularJS does not throw any error out there. Okay, great. Gopi says, please explain slide 29 again. I would do that. Just give me a moment. All right, Gopi, can you tell me what exactly you want me to explain? Okay, the last point, HTTP. We will be talking about HTTP services in detail, but at this particular point of time, remember, $HTTP service is similar to $scope service. If you want to use an AJAX request, which HTTP is the one within Angular that provides AJAX kind of request, XHR request basically. You have to inject $HTTP, otherwise it will throw service injector error. Okay, you have to inject $HTTP to use $HTTP within a controller. That's the whole idea about injecting. That's what I explained when I said. Remember, I said if you want to use $HTTP service or an other service, you have to pass HTTP like this and then call whatever methods. We will not talk about whatever methods right now, we'll talk about it later. But at this particular point of time, remember, if you want to use any other service provided by Angular, you have to inject it within your controller, and the injection is going to be similar to scope, but you have to specify a comma in between. It's provided as an argument. All right. Okay, great. Angular modules. We just saw Angular module in a very superficial manner. We'll talk about that in detail later. But it's basically an effective way of segregating your sections. So maybe if you have a contact us page can have one module. If you have an business intelligence module or an analysis module, you can have a different module. Your root module is going to be one, but you can inject as many dependency modules to AngularJS. Remember we talked about angular.module, name of the module, comma, the array. The array is the one that provides you the dependency. You can create your own module, we'll see that later, and inject it into the Angular application module in the start of your bootstrap of your application, which is going to be this. So if you create an analysis module and name it analysis, you can inject that like this. But at this particular point of time, since we were doing a very simple bootstrap and we were not creating modules, we just used a direct empty dependency, which means that we did not have any dependency for that application. Okay, implemented using a listing of modules as dependency that we just saw right now. But in one single page, an HTML page can have only one application, and that application is going to be defined as ng app, and that is going to be your root module. So if you create many modules with different functionalities, you have to inject those different modules into the root module and bootstrap it. Otherwise, it will not work. One HTML, one root module. That cannot be multiple root modules. Great. Before we get into further terms, one small thing that I really want you guys to understand is, if you notice, I have defined the ng app here. Whatever is between this is the root of your application. So your root scope is going to be whatever is the selector that I have done for this selection. In case of scope, whatever controller you have defined, the scope of the controller is that particular start and end tag of the div. So if you define more controllers with different names, okay, the scope of F is going to be within this, the scope of S is going to be within this. This is going to be the scope, and the root scope is going to be your application scope. All right. Any questions until now? Okay, I have no questions, so we are good to go. Let's quickly get into different key terms here. We saw modules, which provides you modules for your AngularJS. We saw scope, which is basically the dollar scope. And in case of an application, it is going to be root scope. So it is going to be dollar root scope. There are other key terms as well, like directives, which basically provides custom elements and custom controller for that element. So you can create my own HTML tag, and you can use that within your HTML. You can create your own expressions using code bindings. Angular Forms gives you an extended view of the normal HTML form. If you use Angular Forms, you will be able to go ahead, do validation and all directly in the HTML form. It's an extension of the HTML forms that is there. Routing is nothing but basically a route provider by Angular to go from one URL to another, because that's how web applications work, isn't it? To go from one page to another, you need URLs. AngularJS also provides you client-side routing module or service, where you can use those routes to create your client-side routes. It will be independent and separate of your server-side routes. We'll also see that in detail in module 3. Filters do nothing but they format data. Okay, so these are the common terms that you'll come across in our sessions. Remember, directives by default, what do they do? They provide dynamism to your DOM elements, and you can create your own elements by extending your HTML. Expressions are nothing but normal expressions, JavaScript snippets, other than your functions. You can use anything. Forms are basically HTML forms that AngularJS extends to create dynamic forms, where you can do validations and all directly. There are a set of libraries provided by Angular Forms that you can use. Modules, we saw angular.module. You can also create your own module and inject it into the root module. But in one HTML, you can have only one root module. All right. Routing is creating of URLs. It will be client-side URLs independent of server-side. We saw scope. We saw two types of scope. One is the root scope and one is the normal scope within the controller. Filter formats data. Great. So what is dependency injection? Dependency injection is passing of dependency like HTTP to a dependent object like a controller. The service is made part of the client state. So which means that if you inject the dependency, if you are in a URL state of say maybe contact, that particular service will be available for that contact state. Remember, there is a difference between URLs and state, but for the ease of explanation, I have used a URL here. Passing the service to the client rather than allowing a client to build or find the service. Okay, so when you inject the service, it will be available within that particular controller, and you do not have to go ahead and find that particular service. It's a fundamental requirement of the pattern, and that's what dependency injection is all about. Dependency injection is injecting your dependent libraries or functionality into your functions or controllers that extend and make your processing efficient. That's what basically dependency injection is. Gopi says routing could not understand. Don't worry, Gopi, we'll have a look at it later. Just remember that when you create a website, you have, say, for example, home page and a contact us page. Those routes are defined by your server. But here with routing, what you can do is you can create your own client-side routes, and you do not have to connect to the server to go from one route to another, say for example from home route to a contact us route. So that's what the routing is all about. It is going to be independent of your server-side routes altogether. And we are going to see that in detail in module number 4 later. I have a question coming in from Ravi. Ravi is asking, can you explain dependency once again? Yes. If you want to use $HTTP service or an AJAX service within your controller and you do not inject it, what would happen? When you call the HTTP service, the controller will look for the service within your Angular app. Rather, what you're doing is when you instantiate your controller, you pass your $HTTP service so that your controllers don't have to look for or find that particular service. So that method of dynamically injecting your dependency or your service is called as dependency injection. Remember, we injected $HTTP and $scope. That is exactly what your dependency is all about. It will be available throughout that particular controller, or it will be available throughout that particular service, instantiated once or instantiated dynamically on demand. Okay, so that was your dependency injection. Venkat is asking, are you covering breadcrumbs? Can you be more specific, Venkat? In case of what breadcrumbs you are talking about? Are you talking about Bootstrap or are you talking about something else? Venkat is saying navigation. Yes, there is a complete section on navigation in module 3. We will be doing that. But just remember, these are the definitions that you'll encounter time and again. Great. AngularJS is defined and designed in such a way that your structures and your definitions are independent of each other. It does strive towards that. However, there can be scenarios where your coding might break the code. but it is designed to be compatible for MVC and MVVM design patterns, and it is very, very, very much unit testable. We use something called as Karma to run the unit tests, and the only dependency for running Karma or the test runner is that you have to inject Angular mocks. We'll see that in detail. We use something called as Jasmine to do the testing. I believe there is something like JUnit or CUnit, CP unit. There is something called as PHP unit in different languages. Similarly, you have something called as Jasmine, which does the task of unit testing in JavaScript. So we will be using Jasmine to create tests. We'll be injecting Angular mocks to mock that particular application, and we'll run the whole test using Karma, which is basically a task runner, and sorry, not a task runner, a test runner, and it executes all your tests across with some kind of browsers that you specify. So that's what unit testing is all about. And again, the model is in isolation, controllers are in isolation, the interactions can be tracked and can be mocked. So it's very testable. Great. I have I have a hand raised from Ravi. Yes, Ravi. All right, great. I see Ravi just dropped off offline. Let's continue. We just saw how we added our AngularJS. Instead of using the library directly, you can go ahead use the Ajax Google APIs to go ahead load it from the CDN. You bootstrap the application using ng app. You can also do data-ng app, the binding attribute that is provided for HTML. Create controller, create the view, and run the application. We created the controller along with creating a model. In this particular case, it is hello2. It is assigning it to a object. You can also use a function. You can also use a number or a variable out here, and you use that particular object directly within the expression. Like I said, expression is everything other than functions. So if you call the object with object dot property, you should be able to call that. In this particular case, it is hello2 dot title, because we have defined dot title as a property for your hello2 object. All right, great. So we included AngularJS within our application. I had downloaded it, so it was within my library. So I used the link there, but you can also download it directly from your CDN, Google CDN, and initialize your application. You don't have to restrict it to demo. You can use whatever application name that you want with ng app. You can also do data-ng-app. That is also fine, but ng-app suits fine for most of our purposes. It will not throw up an error. We created a controller and we assigned a model to the scope. Remember, the $scope injection, dependency injection is compulsory. There are methods to avoid, but at this particular point of time, remember, it's compulsory. And we use an expression to print that particular controller. Remember, if you define hello2 within a controller, and if you print it outside a controller, it will not print. I'll repeat it again. If your scope of ng controller is div and you print it outside the div of the controller, it will not print because it is outside the scope of that controller. Okay? Remember that always. Great. Let's come back to libraries and frameworks. Any questions until now, friends? Rajesh is asking me, how do you know syntax errors? Okay, let me do one thing. Let me just go ahead, and I have removed this, right? So technically the AngularJS file is not there. So it is going to throw an error. Let me open up my debugger. Let me see the console and let me refresh it. If you notice, it has thrown up an error, anonymous function, because Angular is not defined, and Angular is defined within that particular file that we are including. So let me go ahead, add it back in, and let me make a mistake here and make a mistake with the scope injection because we are injecting the scope. The second error is we have an injector error. Remember we talked about injector, that the Angular injects services and then compiles it along with the DOM to create your dynamic DOM. That's what the error is all about here. So we have got an error here. Say for example, I go ahead and don't inject scope at all, and I go ahead refresh this particular page. I'm getting an error called as scope not defined, naturally because we have not injected scope into this particular application. So let me go ahead and define the scope again, and if I go back and refresh, okay, sorry, that was an error here. That error was because of the model name. Let me just go ahead and remove this up, and it will go ahead and print it. If you notice, there is no ng model on the click because we have not defined anything here. If you want to put the name or the value of the button as the model name itself, you can also do that using this, and you should be able to get that out here. So what I basically did was I took the model name and put it into expression. So whatever button value is there, it was put to test. So that's what we did out here. So remember, whenever we do errors time and again, there will be an error thrown in your console, and at times, you will have the expression printed directly because the expression is not identified. This is very rare generally, and it provides you where exactly the error is happening. Going forward in our further sessions, we'll also see how to go ahead debug your issues, and how we can go ahead and identify how where that particular issue is happening. All right, we'll also do that while we are doing our coding sessions from the next session. Gopi is saying, can you did I answer your question, Rajesh, first? All right. Gopi is saying, can you repeat the injector functionality again? Injector is nothing but dynamically injecting your dependencies. Like I said, you can inject your dependencies. You can do a dependency injection of modules, or you can do a dependency injection of your scope. What basically happens within Angular is when you inject this dependency, AngularJS goes ahead and uses the dollar injector in the background, which is not noticeable to you, and injects dollar scope so that it is usable within that particular controller on demand. It may be either a singleton pattern, which basically means it is initialized as soon as the application is initialized, and it is done once throughout the application lifecycle, or in some particular cases like factory, which we will talk about later, it will instantiate or initialize it only when you need it. So it is instantiated on demand. So these are the two methods in which the injector works. Basically, injector is nothing but your service that Angular provides let me go back, is the service that Angular provides to inject services within Angular so that it can compile the DOM and the scope together to provide a dynamic DOM. It happens in the background, so you will not be able to notice it. But if there is an error, you will get an error specifically when it is dependent on some particular service and you do not inject it. All right. Or if you call a particular service which you have not injected, it will throw up an injector error. Did I answer your question, Gopi? Okay, thank you. Venkat is asking, if we inject in a module and not injected in a function, then what will happen? Well, Venkat, it depends entirely on what you are injecting. If this is actually an intermediate level which I do not want to touch entirely, but I'll surely answer that particular question. If there is a module, external third-party module that you are injecting, and the variable is in the third-party module and you do not inject it into the function, it will throw up an error. However, if it is not um, a service which is the one that you are injecting and you might not need it, like say for example, if you are using jQuery, adding jQuery directly and calling jQuery from within the scope, it will work, but you might not have two-way binding. There are some specific use cases that we'll be talking about in our detailed sessions. But at this particular point of time, remember, most of the things, whether services, factories, functions, or any kind of dependencies, if you inject and you do not inject it into the controller, you will get an injector error. That's what at this particular point of time you should remember. So if there is a dependency and you do not inject it, you might get an error. But there are some specific use cases and specific cases where you might avoid that error, but end of the day you might have some issues with two-way binding or binding related issues that happen. We'll talk about in detail tomorrow. That's actually out of scope for this particular session. We'll talk about that, Venkat, don't worry. Sitaram is asking, why is it called dynamic injector? Well, it is not called dynamic injector. It is called a dependency injector. Sitaram, can you explain your question again? I have a comment from Gopi. I heard that Angular will not allow DOM manipulation. It is completely false. Angular will provide you methods to make the DOM, dynamic, so you can manipulate DOM. That is, a service called as, a function called as Angular.element, where you can manipulate your DOM. It's not right that it cannot do DOM manipulation. It can, but don't do it directly. There are specific methods and ways to do it, using Angular. Okay, so Sitaram, no issues. Don't worry about the misunderstanding. Just remember, it's a dependency injector. So you are injecting the dependency, and that dependency is basically injected in two ways. One, whenever the application starts, a particular service starts once for all. So which means that that particular service is instantiated and is present in the memory. And whenever you do an dependency injection, that service reference is used. However, there are cases like, say, for example, Angular Factory, which we learn in detail in the later sessions, where it is instantiated when you are injecting it into the controller function. So which means that if you don't inject it in, an instance is not created. However, in case of some services, it is done once in an application and the reference is passed in. So that's how the dependency injection works, and there are two ways for that. which is the way you have to use. Either one, and that's the reason why we specifically mention what dependency we want to inject. Ravi says, can you explain the last sentence? Yes, I will. Don't get into a lot of detail. We'll talk about that in detail tomorrow before starting the explanation. There are two kinds of services basically. One is a service, one is a factory. Services or singleton instantiators are instantiated when the Angular app is instantiated. So when your Angular app loads, that particular instance is ready and it is in the browser. So when you do an dependency injection, a reference is passed. However, in case of Angular.factory, which is also a type of service, in that particular case, what happens is when you do a dependency injection, it will be instantiated right at that particular moment and then passed in. So here it's not going to be a reference, it's going to be a new instance that you're passing. For the benefit of people who are listening to this first time, please don't worry about it. We'll talk about in detail tomorrow. But these are the two methods in which you are going to pass a dependency injection. Okay, great. Thanks, Ravi. Let's come back to our session, and we were here, your first program. So remember, whatever is outside the scope is not going to be printed. It's going to throw up an error. Always remember that. It's two-way binding. We'll see two-way binding tomorrow. Two-way binding basically means the update and update from the view to the controller and from the controller to the view happens automatically. So there is two-way communication, and that's the reason the binding also happens two-way. Basically, what's happening is Angular from the background is watching every model constantly, and whenever there is a change, it updates the controller, and if there is a change in the controller, it updates the view. So that's how it basically works. Uh, there is a lot of functionality that goes behind Angular while watching that particular model. All right, great. So libraries versus framework. Remember, I told you libraries are just a set of functionalities that you add to an existing architecture. Example, jQuery. It's just a set of functionalities that you add to your view to make it a little more dynamic. However, in case of Angular, in case of Ember, in case of Meteor, these tell you how to create the architecture, what to follow, how to define your application, and then also provide you, in some cases, different libraries for you to use. All right. Backbone, Knockout, Spine are examples. jQuery are examples of libraries. AngularJS, Ember, Meteor are examples of frameworks. Venkat is asking, auto refresh is not needed. You're right, Venkat, auto refresh is not needed. It refreshes it automatically. That's the beauty of AngularJS. Great. Comparison of frameworks. It's always important. Say you are developing an application, you use a library or a framework, the development or the upgrade stops. What happens? So that's one big risk factor. You have to always think when selecting libraries or frameworks, or for that matter any kind of third-party libraries that you add to AngularJS. Always remember, it has to be used well, it has to be supported well, it has to be maintained well. And in case of AngularJS, it's created by Google team. Knockout, there are 3 people at this particular point of time. Ember at this particular point of time is managed by a company called Tilde, and there is a team to support it. Meteor is well funded. It's a Meteor group. Backbone again is by Document Cloud, and Spine is from an individual. It's not that they might stop. It's not that others are bad. It's not that AngularJS is better. There are cases where AngularJS is good, and there are cases where Ember.js is good. It basically depends on your application. But AngularJS is well supported, and it is well accepted by the community, which means that there will be seldom any issues related to security or seldom issues related to performance lags and so on and so forth. So that's how also you have to decide on what framework to choose. Application built on AngularJS, YouTube Leanback is one, DoubleClick is one, Good Films is one. DoubleClick, I believe, is one of the biggest projects from Google, and it's built on AngularJS. So AngularJS is very scalable. Zap Travel is one. Have a look at these sites. You will have a fair idea of the performance as well as the kind of scalability they have, as well as the kind of features they give to manage your apps online and offline. There are methods to do that and ways to do that we'll talk about later. I have a question for you now. Which are the following valid ng attributes? Which of the following are valid ng attributes? Ng app, ng controller, ng model, all of the above. Can anybody take that question? Oh, all right. I already I'm bounced with a stream of questions. Great, stream of answers before even asking. So everybody says it's 4, which is correct. The answer is 4. In AngularJS, is AngularJS a JavaScript-based framework? Yes, it is. Correct. Why is AngularJS a better framework? Callbacks are not required to be registered. Bootstrap of the app is simple. Data binding between the view and the model is synchronized by the framework. All of the above. Nilesh says 4. Ravi, Aparna, Rajesh says 4. Venkat says 3. Sitaram says 1. All right, great. The answer is 4. I'll tell you there is a point that I think I have not covered during the session. Callbacks are not required to be registered. To be very frank, it does not need to be registered. AngularJS takes care of the callbacks by itself, and that's the beauty of AngularJS. The only places where you see callbacks directly noticeable is when you're creating controllers. You pass a callback as a function, right? So that's also a callback that you're passing, but technically your callbacks don't need to be registered, and you don't have to create callbacks, and you don't have to get into the mess of tracking callbacks and all. You can create it very easily with AngularJS. Bootstrap the app is simple, which is true. Data binding between view and model is synchronized by the means of two-way binding, which is also true, and it is done by the framework is also true. So the answer is all of the above. Great. So we are almost towards the end of this module here, but that is an assignment for you guys. I want you guys to go ahead, answer these questions all by yourself, search the presentation that we did today, maybe go through the recording once again and ask yourself these questions. Is controller just one file, a view, a model, or there are multiple files? Do controllers have a user interface? Does view allow user input? Can a view send messages to the model? Can a view send messages to the controller? What is the interaction between the view and the controller? What is the interaction between the controller and the model? What is the interaction between the model and the view? We have seen all these. Only I believe the first question is going to be a little twisted because we have not seen that very directly. Can you have more than one view? Can you have more than one model? Can you have more than one controller? We have also seen that while we are doing our demo. Most of the answers to this question will be either positive or a direct two-way binding. but I want you to have a definitive answer on this. I'm sure most of these questions will be answered by now. Sitaram is saying, please explain callbacks and Bootstrap once. Bootstrap is nothing but ng app equal to your demo application. That's your Bootstrap. Bootstrap, in other words, basically means initializing of your Angular application. All right. And callback is, okay. Now you're passing this function for the controller. What basically controller does within or in the background is that it takes this function, and wherever this particular controller, first controller is called, this particular function is called, and reference to variables within the function is done. That is what exactly is happening within the controller. Similarly for callbacks, callback is nothing but, say for example, you have a function, okay, which has maybe a function within it, and um, um, you create a function 2 and pass this function to this function and call this function here. That technically means you're doing a callback. Did I answer your question? You're basically passing a function and calling it from a different function with a reference to the first function. They, please go through javascript dot call dot apply. Your answers for your callback should be resolved. All right, but technically this is how it works. You have a function which you are passing as a dependency for your function 2, and your function 2 calls the function 1 with reference to function 1 itself. Okay, so that's what basically callback is. And AngularJS makes it very easy to manage these callbacks. And a callback may also refer to something which is within a service. So you might have a callback that is registered with service. You can also pass something within into that particular service and call it from within HTTP. That is also possible. I mean, in JavaScript, the mix and matches are pretty high because it's a very dynamic language, though it comes with its own problems of tracking the callbacks. Okay, great. For the next modules, I mean, I would sincerely request you to go ahead, try this initialization application, try the code once, try pondering on assignments the questions that we discussed right now, and um great. I put forward this to you. The next module will be talking about dependency injection in detail. There have been instances where the explanations were broken, definitely so, because they need very specific explanations for that. Creating controllers is what we'll see tomorrow, though we saw a brush on controllers today. We'll talk a lot more about two-way binding tomorrow, and we'll see how we can go ahead share data between controllers using services and factories. All right. This will be entirely a mix of demo as well as presentation sessions, and most of your questions should start getting answered when we go a step forward in each module. Sitaram is asking, can we have multiple functions as parameters for controllers? Uh, who would the affect? I don't understand the second question, but for the first question, you can have multiple functions uh, within your controller, but you cannot pass multiple functions as parameters for a controller. One controller, function callback. If you want multiple functions, please go ahead, create your models which can contain your functions and call your models directly. Uh, all right, Sitaram has a follow-up question. He's asking, how would they affect the application? Well, if you pass multiple functions as parameters for the controller, it will not work. Great. Sitaram, uh, I hope I answered your question, but remember this in mind. Uh, the function that we are passing for the controller is basically a callback. So it's basically taking up that particular function and calling it in context to a controller and associating it with the models in the view. That's what it's basically doing. So you basically cannot call more than one callback for that particular controller, because the controller is expecting only one attribute to be passed back. Sure, no issues. Uh, Great. So next time we'll also talk about multiple controllers, why we need multiple controllers. Like I said, you can keep code separate. One section of the page can have different controller, one section of the page can have different controllers. It becomes easier testing, and apart from making it being easier to test, you can also maintain states, which we'll be talking about in module 3. And I forward this to you. We have somewhere around 10 minutes. Please go ahead, ask your questions, anything that you believe want answered.